Rusted hinges scream as Faye shoves the gate open, thorns clawing at both sleeves. 90 acres of ruin sprawl ahead, trees swallowed by brush, limbs gray and lifeless, decades gone wild. Behind her, a realtor mutters something about buying graveyards. Townsfolk gather roadside, shaking heads, certain this woman just threw away everything on dead wood. Nobody guesses what sleeps beneath all that tangle, or how one strange discovery will soon leave an entire county speechless. Quick question before we start. Where are you tuning in from today? Drop it below, hit subscribe, then stay right here with me. The papers were signed a week earlier, at a bank where every officer tried talking her out of it. Faye Dolan didn't listen. She'd spent 30 years on a cannery line 2 towns over, and when the plant shut its doors for good, the severance check felt less like an ending than a door swinging open. Everybody expected her to find another job. She bought a dead orchard instead. The county figured she'd lost her mind. Folks in town called it foolish. Some called it worse. 90 overgrown acres on the ridge hadn't produced a marketable apple in nearly 40 years, ever since the last owner passed and the land went feral. Brush choked the rows. Vines strangled the trunks. To anyone driving by, the place looked like a lost cause wearing bark. Grown men chuckled about it down at the feed store. Women traded worried looks after church. Faye saw it differently, and the reason went back to her grandfather. Amos had been an orchardman his whole life, and as a girl she'd trailed him down every row, learning the feel of good wood, the smell of ripe fruit, the patience trees demand from a person. Those long afternoons taught her more than any classroom. He told her stories, too, but one stayed with her more than any other. There was an apple, he'd say, eyes far away. A variety once famous across the whole county, sweeter than anything in a store, gone now for 100 years. Bulldozed under during hard times, lost to the world. He'd spent decades hunting it and never found a single tree. It haunted him till the day he died. The story had lived in her chest ever since. Faye didn't buy the ridge chasing ghosts. She bought it because it was cheap, because she loved trees, and because a woman starting over at 53 needs ground to stand on. Still, walking those ruined rows that first morning, machete in hand, she felt her grandfather close. "All right, Pop," she whispered to the wind. "Let's see what's left up here." The work ahead would have broken most people half her age. Clearing, cutting, and pruning back decades of wild growth defined whatever living trees survived underneath. The whole town figured she'd quit by spring. Snow would come, they laughed, and she'd be gone. Dawn to dark, Faye worked that ridge alone. She hacked through walls of thorn taller than she stood. She dragged piles of brush into burn heaps, smoke rising over the valley like a signal nobody understood. Blisters split open across both palms, healed rough, then split again. She kept swinging anyway. Nobody came to lend a hand, and she never asked for one. Slowly, an orchard emerged from the ruin. Beneath 40 years of tangle, the old trees were still standing, gnarled, mossy, half strangled, but there. Faye pruned each one the way Amos taught her, cutting away the dead to give the living a fighting chance. Most folks would have called every last tree a goner. She saw something else in that ancient wood. Her grandfather always swore, a tree isn't dead just because it looks the part. Then spring came, and the ridge answered. One cold morning she climbed up to check the rows, and stopped dead in her tracks. On a branch she'd been sure was finished, a single cluster of white blossoms had opened to the sun. A second cluster appeared farther down the row, then another. All across the ridge, trees written off as dead were waking up, dressing themselves in pink and white. The whole ridge was alive again. Faye sank to her knees in the wet grass and wept. If a story about somebody refusing to quit means anything to you, take 1 second and tap that subscribe button. Tales of ordinary folks who see what everyone else overlooks. That's exactly what lives on this channel. You'll really want to be here for what happens next. Because those blossoms were only the beginning. Word drifted down to town that the crazy cannery lady had actually coaxed the dead ridge back to bloom. A few old-timers drove up to see it for themselves. One of them, a retired grower named Walt, stood at the fence line a long time, staring at the blossoms with a strange look on his weathered face. "Faye," he finally said quietly, "you know what kind of trees these are?" She didn't. Not yet. All she knew was that her grandfather's orchard sense hadn't failed her, and that living fruit was coming where the whole county swore nothing ever would again. Summer would tell the rest. She just had to keep them alive until harvest, and that was a promise easier made than kept. Trouble arrived on the wind. Late that spring, the radio warned of a hard frost rolling down from the north, the kind that could kill tender blossoms overnight and take a whole year's fruit with it. Faye stood in her kitchen at midnight, listening to the temperature drop degree by degree, knowing one bad night could erase everything she'd bled for. She didn't go to bed. Instead, she went to work. All through the black, freezing hours, Faye hauled smudge pots and old barrels along the rows, lighting fires to push warmer air through the trees the way Amos once described. Smoke stung her eyes. Her fingers went numb on the matches. Up and down the ridge she staggered, one small fire at a time, fighting the cold with everything she had left. By sunrise, she could barely stand. But the blossoms held. She'd beaten the frost, barely, on nothing but stubbornness and smoke. Then a different frost came, this one from the bank. Her severance was gone, spent on fuel, tools, and taxes, and Faye had nothing left to count on except a harvest still months away. A letter arrived reminding her the property payment was due, and a man from a development company drove all the way up the ridge to make an offer. "Sell now," he said, smiling. "Take the easy money before those old trees disappoint you." For one long moment, standing in the very orchard she'd fought so hard to save, Faye was tempted. The number he named would clear every debt. It would end the exhaustion, the worry, the aching hands. All she had to do was sign away the ridge and walk off, and nobody in town would blame her one bit. Easy money for a woman with empty pockets. She looked past the man's shoulder, out at the trees. They hung heavy with tiny green fruit now, hundreds of them, thousands, swelling a little more with every passing day. Whatever those apples were, they hadn't shown themselves yet. Quitting now meant never knowing. "No," Faye said, surprising even herself. "This ground's not for sale." The man shrugged, climbed into his truck, and left her alone with the gamble. She watched his dust settle on the road, then turned back to the rows. Harvest was coming, and with it, an answer 100 years in the making. Harvest came in the golden hush of early fall, and the ridge hung heavy with fruit. The apples looked unlike anything Faye had ever seen in a store. Deep crimson streaked with gold, small and firm, almost glowing in the slanted light. She plucked one from a branch, rubbed it on her sleeve, and took a bite. Sweetness flooded her mouth, rich and honeyed and strange, like no apple she'd tasted in 53 years of living. Her hands began to shake, though she couldn't yet say why. Something about the fruit felt older than the ridge itself. Faye filled a basket and drove straight to the county extension office, then to a university 2 hours south, chasing anyone who might tell her what grew on her ridge. Finally, she found an elderly pomologist, a fruit historian who'd spent his career cataloging apples. He took one look at the fruit in her basket and went completely still. "Where?" he whispered. "Did you get these?" She told him about the abandoned ridge, the dead-looking trees, the year of impossible work. The old scholar picked up an apple with trembling fingers, turned it over, cut it, tasted it. Then tears filled his eyes. "Young lady," he said, his voice breaking, "this variety has been considered extinct for over 100 years. There isn't supposed to be a single living tree left on Earth." He said it twice, as though his own ears refused to believe him. Faye's knees nearly buckled. In that instant, she finally understood. The lost apple. Her grandfather's apple. The one he'd chased his whole life and died still searching for. It had never truly vanished. Instead, the trees had waited, hidden under 40 years of brush on a forgotten ridge, for somebody stubborn enough to carry them back into the light. Word tore through the county like wildfire. A variety thought gone for a century, alive again. 90 acres of living history nobody knew existed. Reporters called, experts drove in from 3 states, and the very townsfolk who'd laughed now stood at Faye's fence with their mouths hanging open. She'd bought a graveyard, they'd all said, a money pit, some fool's dead orchard. Faye stood among her fruit-laden rows, one hand resting on a branch of a grandfather's rediscovered legacy, and let them look. What she'd found up there was only starting to change everything. Nobody in that whole town saw what came next. The rediscovered apple made Faye's Ridge the most talked-about orchard in the region, then across the state, and eventually far beyond it. Nurseries begged for cuttings, cider makers offered fortunes for the fruit. Heritage fruit societies sent members from across the country just to stand among trees the world had written off as extinct, cameras raised, voices hushed like folks in a church. License plates in her drive came from a dozen different states. Faye could have sold the whole thing for more money than she'd earned in 30 years on the line. Enough to retire on twice over, and then some. She didn't. Instead, she grafted her grandfather's apple onto new rootstock, producing hundreds of young trees each season and shipping them wherever someone promised to plant and protect them. A variety that had teetered on the edge of the grave began spreading across the country again, one careful cutting at a time. Amos, she liked to think, was finally at peace. The development man never came back. Faye paid off the ridge and then some. She fixed the old farmhouse, hired hands from town, including a few who'd laughed loudest, and turned the orchard into something living and whole. Every autumn, buyers and pilgrims climbed her road for a taste of the apple that came back from the dead. Children pressed cider from windfalls while their folks lined up to buy. Old Walt became her orchard manager, while the pomologist became a lifelong friend. Together, they made sure the variety would never be lost again. What Amos spent a lifetime hunting, his granddaughter had saved for good. "You know what your grandpa would say?" Walt asked her one evening, both of them watching the sun sink gold behind the loaded trees. Faye smiled, eyes shining. "He'd say I finally found it for him." Years later, people still make the drive up that ridge and shake their heads at the story. A laid-off cannery worker sank her last dollar into 90 abandoned acres everyone swore were dead, and gave the world back a treasure it thought it had lost forever. She never forgot standing alone at that rusted gate, the whole town certain she'd lost her mind. And she never once regretted pushing it open. Because sometimes what looks abandoned isn't gone at all. Sometimes it's just waiting for someone to believe. Funny thing about abandoned places. Now and then, something truly priceless is still breathing under all that quiet neglect, waiting for one person to look closer. Faye found it when nobody else would. If her story touched you, Tap subscribe and share it with someone who needs the reminder today.